On August 6th at 8:15 a.m., everything in Hiroshima stopped and the world changed forever. In a matter of moments, a once thriving city became a wasteland, with ruins and lifeless bodies strewn across the streets. Shadows etched in stone are all that remains of some of the victims. The devastation was unprecedented, as if all the horrors of World War II had been concentrated in that instant. And for Hiroshima and its inhabitants, this was only the beginning. Many paths led to this decisive moment, from the expansionist ambitions of the land of the rising sun to the tireless offensive of the United States. The United States developed the ultimate weapon to conclusively end the war. Nearly 70,000 people perished instantly, marking a dark turning point in human history. The consequences of the devastation followed the local inhabitants for decades. Even today, Hiroshima remains a testament to destruction, and the results seem to justify the actions. What happened to the bodies shortly after the bomb exploded in Hiroshima? The storm from the east, Japan's strategic rise amidst the flames of war. Japan was the first nation to defeat a European power when it defeated Russia in 1905. Japan soon pursued a path of military conquest in the first half of the 20th century. This victory encouraged Japan and its aggressive policy toward its neighbors. By 1910, the Korean peninsula formally became part of the empire. As World War I began shortly after, Japan found itself the sole regional power in the Far East. Japan joined the Triple Entente, along with France, Great Britain and Russia, against the common enemy Germany, which possessed colonies such as the Mariana, Caroline and Marshall Islands. Without significant opposition, these islands soon became Japanese. After the war, the world's democracies tolerated the expansionist policies of totalitarian regimes in Europe, and something similar happened with militaristic Japan. In 1931, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria in China, a province already under strong Japanese economic influence. By the end of the following year, the conquest of this province north of Korea was complete, and Japan established a puppet state called Manchukuo. In 1933, Jehol province was added to Manchukuo, and in 1936, neighboring Inner Mongolia was also made a puppet state under imperial control. When it became clear that the League of Nations was unable to curb the territorial ambitions of aggressive nations, Japan went even further. The attack on the remaining Chinese territories began in 1937 in one of the bloodiest wars of the 20th century. Japan displayed unspeakable brutality toward Chinese civilians, especially in Nanjing, the Chinese capital, where around 200,000 civilians lost their lives. Soon, Japan gained the upper hand and occupied large parts of China, and this war became part of World War II. Before the global conflict, Japan agreed to become part of the Axis powers. In 1936, it signed the Anti-Comintern Pact against the Soviet Union, and in 1940, well into the war, it signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. This pact solidified Japan's relations with these European powers and led to more aggressive actions against the Allies, in addition to coordinating its attacks with Germany and Italy. With France and Great Britain focused on Europe, Japan faced less opposition in its conquest of its enemies' colonies. Taking advantage of the situation, Japan advanced into French Indochina, thus declaring its intention to create a vast empire in Southeast Asia, full of resources. By 1941, Japan had conquered all of present-day Vietnam from France. At this point, the two major powers remaining in the Pacific were Japan and the United States. The success of Japanese expansion was not based solely on isolated victories, but on a highly centralized military structure. The Imperial Japanese Army was organized into military regions that operated with tactical autonomy but under strategic coordination from Tokyo. The Kwantung Army, in particular, was key in the Northeast Asian campaigns, acting as an occupation force and driving force for operations in Manchuria. Furthermore, Japan devoted a large part of its industrial production to the manufacture of light weapons, mobile artillery, and armored trains, essential elements for sustaining a war of movement in vast territories such as China and Korea. The railway network controlled by Japan allowed for rapid deployments and efficient resupply, while companies such as Mitsubishi and Kawasaki adapted their lines to produce military equipment on a large scale. This combination of logistical planning, regional numerical superiority, and operational brutality allowed the empire to advance quickly and with little opposition. The United States remained neutral, although it strongly supported Great Britain through trade relations and convoys. The Axis powers had tense relations with the United States, which culminated on December 7, 1941. That day, Japan launched a surprise air attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack destroyed or damaged several battleships and killed more than 2,400 Americans. From that moment on, the United States became an active enemy and member of the Allied forces. Although the attack on Pearl Harbor did not destroy as much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet as initially feared, Japan had a temporary advantage. The empire used this advantage to further expand its control. By the end of December, Japan occupied Hong Kong, the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island in early 1942. Japan reached its territorial peak in February when it captured Singapore from the British in one of Britain's worst defeats, which left 80,000 men prisoners. The conquest continued with the fall of the last American stronghold in the Philippines, the Bataan Peninsula. In April, Japanese forces overwhelmed the defenders and won the battle, once again displaying their brutality by forcing the surviving prisoners to march 100 kilometers. At the time, Japan seemed unstoppable, but it faced a new and powerful enemy willing to use its full force against the nation of the rising sun. Changing course, America's resurgence in the Pacific theater. After Pearl Harbor, the United States desired revenge, and the conflict between the Pacific superpowers intensified. The United States had become a global economic power after World War I, but this was the first time anyone had attacked its territory, which first generated surprise among the American public and later a call for revenge. American pride was at stake, but Japan was still on the offensive, and the United States needed to resist and stop this aggressive campaign. The turnaround in the Pacific was not only due to military tactics, but to the colossal logistical apparatus mobilized by the United States. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Congress authorized unprecedented military spending with more than $300 billion allocated for wartime defense. This investment translated into a production capacity that no other country could match. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States built more than 120 aircraft carriers, 350 destroyers, and 17 million tons of merchant ships. At this rate, more tons of ships were launched each month than the entire active Japanese fleet. In the air, the difference was even more pronounced. American factories produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, many of them long-range bombers like the B-17 and B-29, capable of reaching Japanese territory from remote bases. This air superiority allowed for sustained attrition campaigns that weakened Japanese defenses before each landing. To maintain a steady flow of troops, fuel, and ammunition, the United States built maritime supply networks stretching from California to Australia, passing through islands like Guam, New Caledonia, and the Marshall Islands. Ground logistics were also critical. More than 8 million American soldiers were mobilized in the Pacific theater, supported by more than 300,000 military vehicles, including light tanks, transport trucks, and jeeps. Each operation required tons of food, water, weapons, uniforms, and medical supplies organized from collection centers in Hawaii and the Philippines. Artificial docks, floating hospitals, and improvised airfields became part of the war landscape, ensuring that each conquered island served as a base for the next offensive. This logistical dominance not only facilitated offensives but also neutralized the Japanese ability to recover. While Japanese forces suffered shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, the United States could resupply an entire division in a matter of days. The battle was no longer just about territory, but about sustainability, and in that arena, the American machine was unbeatable. The most pivotal moment occurred in June 1942, when the Japanese Navy attempted to destroy the remnants of the U.S. fleet at Midway and finish the job started at Pearl Harbor. However, the Americans were prepared, as this surprise attack was no surprise at all. American cryptographers had broken the Japanese naval code, and the U.S. military was ready. Japan lost the battle and suffered heavy casualties. The Battle of Midway marked the turning point of World War II in the Pacific, as the United States took the attacking role after this victory. American forces capitalized on this victory, and a bloody battle on Guadalcanal ensued in the summer of 1942, lasting 6 months. In that battle, one important detail was decisive. The Allies had far greater resources, while the Japanese forces suffered from shortages of supplies and received almost no reinforcements, so they had to withdraw from the island in February 1943. After that battle, Japan suffered only defeats. After the decisive defeat at Guadalcanal, Japan began losing island after island, while America implemented an island-hopping strategy. One of the last attempts at resistance and a turnaround in the war was during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. In that battle, Japan suffered another loss from which its air force could not recover. The fall of Saipan shortly after, combined with the American air advantage, began the bombing of the Japanese home islands. The largest naval battle in history, in Leyte Gulf in October 1944, marked the end of the Imperial Navy. The end was inevitable, and when the US military captured strategic islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, the war officially reached Japanese soil, but the Japanese army refused to surrender. Its desperate defense inflicted heavy casualties on the American military. Although defeat was imminent, nothing changed in the mindset of the Japanese military leadership, nor that of Emperor Hirohito. This desperation also led to the infamous kamikaze tactics, where pilots loaded their planes with explosives and aimed them directly at Allied ships. These tactics caused fear among Allied sailors, but they did not change the outcome of the war. The Battle of Okinawa showed the lengths Allies were willing to go to stop the Americans. The kamikazes inflicted nearly 5,000 enemy casualties, and Allied losses were enormous. Japan lost more than 100,000 soldiers during the 2.5 months of battle, some as young as 14. This battle led to a discussion about how many Allied soldiers would have to die to conquer Japan's mainland. With the war in Europe over, Japan was the only Axis power still fighting. The 32nd US President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, died in April, and his Vice President, Harry Truman, took office, charged with ending the war. The only remaining objective was to occupy Japan. The planned invasion, codenamed Operation Downfall, was estimated to cost the lives of at least 500,000 American soldiers. That was a risk Truman was unwilling to take, as there was another way to win the war: the science of mass destruction. Dawn of the atomic age, revolutionary advances in nuclear science amid global conflict. Nuclear science has come a long way from its humble beginnings to the moment that forever changed the history of warfare. It all began in the late 19th century with a series of groundbreaking discoveries. In 1896, Henri Becquerel made a startling observation. Certain materials could emit radiation without any external source of energy. This discovery would soon become known as radioactivity, opening up an entirely new field of study. Soon after, the two greatest names in early nuclear science, Marie and Pierre Curie, took Becquerel's findings even further by isolating radioactive elements such as polonium and radium. Their work revealed the powerful forces within the atom, unknown to humanity until then, and thus the famous pair challenged the long-held belief that the atom was the indivisible and smallest component of matter. However, they were not the only ones working in this field. As the 20th century opened up new possibilities, a New Zealand physicist, Ernest Rutherford, continued to explore and expand the boundaries of atomic science. In 1911, he made a discovery stemming from his famous gold foil experiment. Rutherford proposed a new atomic model with a small, dense nucleus at the center. This discovery was a turning point for nuclear science, marking the birth of modern nuclear physics. By 1919, Rutherford had advanced even further by performing the first artificial nuclear reaction, bombarding nitrogen atoms with alpha particles and converting them into oxygen. This experiment hinted at a new possibility, that the atomic nucleus could be manipulated, releasing enormous amounts of energy. Over the next decade, discoveries in nuclear physics followed rapidly. Niels Bohr's atomic model helped explain how electrons behave inside atoms. Meanwhile, physicists such as Enrico Fermi began experimenting with neutrons, bombarding various elements to investigate their atomic structure. An extremely important aspect emerged: nuclear fission, the process by which the nucleus of an atom splits, releasing a colossal amount of energy. In 1938, shortly before World War II, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann successfully demonstrated this process by splitting uranium atoms. Shortly thereafter, Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch explained the physics behind this phenomenon. the implications of nuclear fission became immediately clear to scientists. As something small capable of releasing immense power, it became a potential weapon of unprecedented destruction. And as World War II tilted in favor of the Axis at the outset, fears grew that Nazi Germany might be the first to develop this terrible new weapon. This fear fueled efforts in the United States and Great Britain to harness nuclear fission for military purposes. Before the start of World War II, nuclear research had already become an international endeavor with multiple active development centers. Germany, which boasted some of the world's most advanced physicists, such as Werner Heisenberg and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, had established state laboratories to study the applications of fission following Otto Hahn's discovery. The Nazi regime, however, placed severe restrictions on Jewish scientists, causing a talent drain that weakened its scientific leadership. Even so, German advances in theoretical physics were significant enough to raise alarm in other powers. In the United Kingdom, the MAUD Committee, established in 1940, brought together leading British physicists to assess the feasibility of an atomic bomb. Their findings, based on experiments by Otto Frisch and Rudolf Peierls, affirmed that a uranium bomb was not only possible but achievable with a surprisingly small amount of fissile material. This information would later be shared with the United States, serving as a catalyst for the escalation of the US nuclear program. At the same time, Canada collaborated closely with the United Kingdom, providing technical resources and access to uranium ore from the Belgian Congo. In the Soviet Union, nuclear energy research was progressing slowly due to a lack of technical infrastructure and political purges affecting the academic world. However, groups led by scientists such as Igor Kurchatov had already begun studies on chain reactions, albeit with limited access to fissile material. Meanwhile, in France, Frédéric Joliot-Curie and his team at the Collège de France were investigating the possibility of self-sustaining reactions, but were interrupted by the German invasion in 1940. The flow of information between these groups was limited by war, censorship, and the growing militarization of science. However, the knowledge accumulated in different parts of the world formed a latent network of nuclear capabilities. This silent competition generated concern among physicists exiled in the United States who understood that mastery of atomic fission was no longer exclusive to any one country. The possibility that Germany would be the first to develop a weapon based on this principle was real, and this perception drove crucial decisions that would follow. In August 1939, physicists Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein wrote to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In this letter, they attempted to impress upon him the importance of this new weapon and asked for his support for atomic energy research. They also warned the president that the Germans were likely already working on it. Their warning led to the creation of the Manhattan Project, a monumental secret effort to build the world's first atomic bomb. From theory to reality, the Manhattan Project's quest for nuclear supremacy. Upon receiving the warning letter from the world's leading scientists, President Roosevelt decided to act immediately, and thus the seed of the atomic bomb was planted. Roosevelt established the Uranium Advisory Committee in October 1939, just 2 months after receiving the letter. This committee was chaired by physicist Lyman Briggs, and their task was to investigate whether nuclear fission could be used for military purposes, and more specifically, whether it could be used to build a bomb. However, in the early stages, the government provided only modest funding for nuclear research, which slowed progress. Fortunately, the Americans had allies in Europe also working on atomic energy research. British scientists made significant progress when they demonstrated that a uranium-based bomb was not only possible, but achievable in a surprisingly short time. As the war in Europe continued, the British government decided to share this vital information with their American counterparts. With these new findings, American progress accelerated, and the United States began to prioritize nuclear research. By 1942, the Manhattan Project became official, and the mission came under the control of the Army Corps of Engineers and a man named General Leslie Groves, a determined and pragmatic leader who would oversee the entire operation. It soon became clear that the project needed a brilliant scientific mind at the helm. It was then that Groves turned to J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from California with a reputation as a brilliant thinker and natural leader. Born in 1904, Oppenheimer was a child prodigy who excelled in the sciences. After graduating from Harvard, he studied in England and Germany, cementing his name in the field of quantum mechanics. His early work made him a rising star in theoretical physics. Although Oppenheimer wasn't just a scientist, he was also politically engaged with left-wing tendencies that raised suspicions about his loyalties. However, his brilliance and ability to unite minds made him Grove's choice to lead the Manhattan Project's scientific efforts. The first task was choosing a location, and the team opted for Los Alamos in New Mexico, a remote plateau surrounded by deserts and mountains, ideal for the project's secrecy. In 1943, construction began on a new facility that would soon become the heart of the project. As scientists and their families arrived, Los Alamos transformed into a small secret community. The town did not officially exist on any map, and those who worked there simply referred to it as the Hill. The logistical scale of the Manhattan Project was as colossal as its scientific ambition. At its peak, more than 130,000 people worked directly in its various facilities, from theoretical physicists and chemists to laborers, technicians, and military personnel. These people were spread across multiple locations: Los Alamos in New Mexico, Hanford in Washington State, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and several auxiliary plants in other states. Most were unaware that they were contributing to the construction of a bomb. Oak Ridge uranium enrichment plant consumed more electricity than the entire city of New York, with a demand of over 200 megawatts per day. 3 separation methods were developed there: gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation calatrons, and experimental centrifugal processes, all operating simultaneously in facilities the size of small towns. The Hanford site, meanwhile, was responsible for producing plutonium through nuclear reactors and chemical extraction plants, operations never before carried out on an industrial scale. The total cost of the Manhattan Project amounted to more than $2 billion at the time, equivalent to more than $30 billion today. The construction and operating budget for Oak Ridge alone exceeded $500 million, and that of Los Alamos, $74 million. To maintain secrecy, financial records were fragmented, purchases were channeled through shell companies, and budget allocations were distributed as generic civilian or defense projects. The level of secrecy was such that even some high-ranking government officials were unaware of the project's full existence until shortly before the final tests. These figures reflect that the Manhattan Project was not just a scientific initiative, but an unprecedented industrial and military undertaking, built with a precision that only an economy mobilized for total war could sustain. Life there was strange and often difficult. The need for absolute secrecy meant that workers were isolated from the outside world, and many scientists only knew the part of the project they were working on. Engineers working on uranium enrichment or plutonium production didn't know what end their efforts were directed toward. People lived under constant surveillance, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter and all correspondence censored. But although conditions were harsh and many didn't know the ultimate purpose, the scientists knew they were working on something of the utmost importance, and many of the greatest minds were present. Scientists like Enrico Fermi and Richard Feynman worked alongside Nobel Prize laureate Niels Bohr. All were aware that what they were creating would change the world, though they rarely discussed its moral implications. Oppenheimer's leadership united all these geniuses in a single mission. They had 2 choices before them: a uranium-based bomb or a plutonium-based bomb. The uranium bomb was simpler, using a mechanism that would join 2 pieces of uranium together to create a chain reaction. On the other hand, the plutonium bomb required a much more complex approach. Plutonium proved more difficult to handle than uranium, and the implosion mechanism required a precision that was initially difficult to achieve. In the end, they achieved both. From silence to shockwave, the Trinity test and the birth of the bomb, the scientists, led by Oppenheimer, achieved their goals and created the most devastating bomb, although the project was still in an experimental phase. The next phase was to test the weapon, and the perfect location was a desert in New Mexico, far from any population. The test was scheduled for July 16th. Codenamed Trinity, the test was kept under the utmost secrecy, as its creators knew it would change the course of history. Although the project team was made up of leading experts, they were unsure of the test's outcome. The bomb was mounted high on a steel tower to simulate an aerial detonation. When the countdown began, the team took refuge in bunkers several miles away. J. Robert Oppenheimer remained resolute. Every calculation and $2 billion were at stake. The moment of truth came at 5:29 in the morning. At that instant, the bomb exploded, and an intense, bright light covered everything. A mushroom cloud began to form over the blast site. The heat was felt for miles around, and the sound rumbled like thunder. Those present, including veteran generals and hardened scientists, were stunned into silence. Oppenheimer then uttered the famous words from an ancient Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Some celebrated, while others were terrified by his creation. The Trinity test yielded results that exceeded the expectations of many. The bomb had released a destructive force equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. The steel tower vaporized, and the desert sand beneath the blast turned to glass due to the intense heat, leaving a radioactive crater. The world's first nuclear explosion marked the beginning of a new era in warfare. The test was a complete success, and no other was necessary. The bomb was ready for war. Since there were two possible types, the scientific team immediately decided to build two different types of bombs. The first used uranium and was codenamed Little Boy. The other, similar to the one tested at Trinity, used plutonium and was called Fat Boy. Both bombs were transported under heavy guard to the Pacific island of Tinian. The Little Boy bomb was carried by the USS Indianapolis. The bomb was transported in pieces and carefully assembled on Tinian. The plutonium bomb, Fat Man, arrived in parts on separate planes for safety reasons. Everyone involved was fully aware of the devastating power of these bombs, and some began to oppose the use of atomic bombs on moral grounds. They were terrified by the destructive potential of this new weapon and the damage it could cause. The final warning, the Potsdam Ultimatum, and Japan's fatal decision. There were many moral reasons against using such a powerful weapon that could cause hundreds of thousands of casualties. The United States government decided to attempt to end the war without using the atomic bomb. This final attempt took place during the Potsdam Conference. Just one day after the test in New Mexico, the Allied conference began in Potsdam, near Berlin. Germany was already defeated, and the main topic of the conference was the nation's post-war fate. Furthermore, Japan was still at war, and that situation needed to be resolved as soon as possible. President Harry S. Truman arrived in Potsdam with a critical decision on his shoulders. The U.S. military had already caused significant damage to Japanese cities through bombing, including the devastating fires of Tokyo. Still, Japan refused to surrender, clinging to its military code of honor and the belief that it was preferable to fight to the last man than face the dishonor of capitulation. U.S. military experts anticipated heavy casualties in the impending invasion. The clear answer was the atomic bomb, but the president was still reluctant to use it. So Truman, along with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, signed the Potsdam Declaration, issued on July 26th. The declaration called for Japan's unconditional surrender and outlined the terms of Japanese defeat. These terms were harsh, similar to those given to Germany. The only gesture of goodwill toward the Japanese was the possibility of the emperor keeping his throne. This final ultimatum warned Japan that if it did not surrender, it would face swift and utter destruction. Japan's response to the Potsdam Declaration was not encouraging. The Japanese government, led by Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, was divided over how to respond to the Allies' demands. Many within the military remained committed to fighting, even as the situation grew increasingly desperate. Suzuki, although personally inclined toward peace, was pressured by the more hardline elements who believed in the idea of a decisive battle on Japanese soil, hoping that a massive last stand could force more favorable surrender terms. 2 days after the ultimatum, the Japanese government decided to ignore the Potsdam Conference, according to a press conference. Although Japan seemed firm in its decision, its officials secretly attempted to negotiate peace through the Soviet Union, as that communist nation was not yet at war with Japan. But it was too late, as Stalin had promised to enter the war as soon as possible. This also accelerated the decision to use the atomic bomb, as the United States did not want a shared occupation and the possible division of Japan into communist and capitalist parts similar to Germany. Truman consulted with his closest advisors, including Secretary of War Henry Stimson and General Leslie Groves, director of the Manhattan Project. Most of his inner circle believed that the use of the bomb was justified, given the potential costs of a ground invasion. In the face of Japan's apparent rejection of the Potsdam Ultimatum, Truman felt that the decision had already been made. In the final days of the conference, orders were issued to drop the first atomic bomb, little boy. A city of ashes, Hiroshima, and the beginning of nuclear war. Hiroshima was a major city, home to around 350,000 people in 1945. It was a strategic transportation hub with several military installations and manufacturing plants that contributed to Japan's war effort. Although strategically important, the city had not suffered major damage during Allied bombing to that point, making it the perfect target for the atomic bomb. Its geography was also ideal. The urban area surrounded by mountains would increase the impact of the bomb. The morning of August 6th began like any other that summer. The sky was clear and the sun shone down on the busy streets of Hiroshima, where people continued with their morning routines. At 8:15, everything changed. 3 American bombers flew over the city. The first, the Great Artiste, carried scientific instruments. The second, Necessary Evil, was tasked with photographing the explosion. And the third, and most important, the Enola Gay, carried and dropped the atomic bomb. When the Enola Gay released Little Boy, the bomb exploded about 600 meters above the city. In an instant, the center of Hiroshima was engulfed in a blinding flash of light followed by a massive fireball. Temperatures at the epicenter reached 4,000 degrees Celsius, vaporizing buildings, vehicles, and people. The explosion generated a shockwave that leveled everything within a 3-kilometer radius. Nearly 70,000 people died instantly, either vaporized by the heat or crushed by collapsing structures. In some places, the heat bleached stone and concrete surfaces white, except where people or objects had stood, leaving shadows marking the location of those who had protected those areas. One of the most famous shadows is that of a person sitting on the steps near the Hiroshima bank. The mushroom cloud rose over the city, visible for miles around, while the streets were transformed into a nightmarish wasteland of ash, twisted steel, and bodies. Survivors near the epicenter found themselves in a surreal, apocalyptic landscape. Fires broke out across the city, fueled by the debris and the intense heat. People outside suffered severe burns, their skin peeled off as they wandered through the ruins in shock, begging for water. Many were too stunned to comprehend what had happened. The luckiest were those who had been protected by concrete buildings or were underground, though even they emerged to face scenes of horror. Those farther from the center and who survived the initial blast suffered extreme burns, radiation sickness, or injuries caused by debris. Hospitals and medical centers were destroyed, leaving the injured without care. In the hours following the bombing, Hiroshima became a scene of chaos. Survivors sought help, but fires and destruction made it nearly impossible for rescue teams to reach these areas. Those who escaped direct impact fled the city in search of water and shelter, many collapsing from exhaustion and injuries along the way. Rivers swelled with people desperate to soothe their burns, though many of them would die soon after. After a few hours, the news reached Tokyo, and those who went to investigate were in shock. Hiroshima had basically ceased to exist. The atomic bomb attack shook the Japanese government to its core. Already in a desperate situation, enduring intense bombing, nothing could have prepared them for this. Still, the Japanese military command was divided. Despite the unimaginable devastation, some of the most hardline leaders were still hesitant to surrender. They believed they could force better terms in a negotiated peace if they continued fighting. Faced with the destruction, the emperor was informed of the situation, but at that point there was still no decision to surrender. Soon, the situation would become even worse. The second strike, Nagasaki and the liberation of atomic terror. 3 days after the events in Hiroshima, the next atomic bomb followed the path of destruction. Nagasaki, a historic port city with a unique blend of Japanese and Western cultures, was the second city attacked with an atomic bomb. The original target had actually been the city of Kokura, but thick cloud cover over Kokura that day forced the crew to switch targets to Nagasaki. At 11:02 in the morning, after searching for an opening in the clouds, the B-29 bomber Boxcar released the bomb on the city. It detonated at an altitude of approximately 500 meters, near Urakami Cathedral, a Catholic church in the city. Unlike Hiroshima, which was mostly flat, Nagasaki's mountainous terrain helped limit the extent of the devastation. Even so, the impact was catastrophic. Approximately 40,000 people were killed instantly, and tens of thousands more were seriously injured. Mitsubishi factories, crucial to Japan's war production, were destroyed along with homes, schools, and hospitals. Fires quickly broke out, and a column of black smoke rose into the sky as the northern half of the city lay in ruins. Those who survived the initial blast faced a grim reality. The heat had been so intense that many people's clothing and skin clung to their bodies. The blast wave sent debris and glass flying through the air, causing deep cuts and wounds. In the hours after the attack, survivors in Nagasaki struggled to understand what had happened. The long-term effects, including radiation sickness, were not immediately understood, but soon people began to fall ill, losing hair and teeth, and their bodies weakened. Those who had escaped the blast now faced a slow, painful decline from radiation exposure. The devastation of Nagasaki was not just the destruction of a strategic target, but the elimination of centuries of history and culture in the blink of an eye. Japanese officials in Tokyo were again in shock. News of Nagasaki's destruction arrived quickly, but as after Hiroshima, there was disbelief that such devastating power could be unleashed again so soon. They had barely processed the magnitude of the first atomic bombing when another city had been leveled. Survivors' accounts and reconnaissance reports confirmed what had happened, and leaders faced mounting pressure to make a decision. The final act, Japan's surrender and the closing of the global conflict. 6 days after the second atomic bomb, Japan declared its unconditional surrender. Even after the devastation these bombs wreaked on the country, some groups within the military wanted to continue the war, which sparked intense debates within the government. The emperor brought the news to the people via radio and, following this announcement, ordered the government to accept the terms of the Potsdam Conference. On September 2, 1945, representatives of the Japanese government formally signed the instrument of surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. This moment, and the surrender before General Douglas MacArthur, symbolized the end of the era of militarism in Japan. The signing ceremony concluded with the Japanese representatives acknowledging their defeat and agreeing to comply with the terms set by the Allies. The surrender process took place without the presence of the emperor, who did not personally attend the ceremony. However, his authority was implicit in the act, and the signing represented a direct acceptance of his support for the surrender. The emperor's participation was crucial in legitimizing the surrender process, as his approval helped unite the Japanese people and government in accepting defeat. Japan had to endure harsh peace conditions. The military was disbanded, and all military activities were prohibited. Economic and constitutional reforms began almost immediately, and among these changes, the Allied powers insisted on the Tokyo trials to hold Japanese leaders accountable for war crimes committed during the conflict. These reforms had one goal: to reintegrate Japan into the international community. This included fostering peaceful relations with other nations and participating in international organizations, integrating Japan into a new order based on cooperation and peace. Emperor Hirohito was allowed to remain emperor, although his role changed from a divine authority figure to a constitutional monarch, symbolizing Japan's transition to a democratic nation. This change was significant in maintaining public order and preserving a sense of national identity during a period of great transformation. Hibakusha, living testimonies of the human cost of nuclear war. Japan recovered from the immense destruction of World War II, but many people had to live with severe injuries and trauma from the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These people are known in Japan as Hibakusha, or blast-affected people. In the first days after the bombings, the primary task was identifying and burying the deceased. Some survivors attempted to identify their loved ones through personal belongings or other recognizable features. However, in many cases, this was impossible due to the extent of the injuries. Mass graves were dug, but the burial process was slow, so the government resorted to cremating the victims' remains. The horror of the aftermath also included trauma for the survivors and the community, as almost everyone had to live with the loss of family members, friends, and neighbors. This psychological burden often manifested in the form of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. In addition to these mental health problems, they also suffered from health issues, as many suffered terrible burns and other injuries. Among them, the elderly and children suffered the most. Medical facilities were overwhelmed as hospitals had been destroyed or severely damaged. Doctors and nurses struggled to treat the large number of patients, often without essential supplies and medicines. In the following years, many survivors found it difficult to talk about their experiences, leading them to feel isolated and hopeless. Social stigma further complicated the lives of Hibakusha. In the years following the bombings, survivors faced discrimination and prejudice as their visible scars and illnesses set them apart from others. Misconceptions about radiation exposure fueled fear and misunderstanding in the general population. Many people believed Hibakusha carried communicable diseases, which led to social rejection. This stigma was particularly noticeable in Japan, where the concept of cleanliness and health is culturally important. Because of this, many Hibakusha chose to hide their true identity. Over time, serious health problems began to emerge, including leukemia, cancer, and other illnesses related to radiation exposure. As they were the first victims of this new weapon, their knowledge of its effects was limited. Doctors could not understand the full impact on people's immune systems, making effective medical care difficult. Later research showed that the percentage of Hibakusha who developed these illnesses was much higher due to radiation exposure. Eventually, the Japanese government recognized the Hibakusha's plight and began providing assistance. In 1957, the Atomic Bomb Survivors Act was enacted, providing medical care, financial support, and disability benefits to those affected. The law established a framework for medical screening and treatment, although its implementation was criticized as insufficient. Many Hibakusha struggled to access the resources they needed, and bureaucratic barriers made it difficult to receive adequate care. Some survivors were also hesitant to seek help because of the stigma associated with their condition. Cultural and community support systems emerged as a vital lifeline for Hibakusha. Many survivors found solace in shared experiences, forming support groups and organizations dedicated to advocating for their rights and raising awareness about the effects of nuclear war. These groups worked tirelessly to document the stories of the Hibakusha, ensuring that their experiences would not be forgotten. From the rise of the Japanese military to the American strategy of island hopping, World War II brought many horrors and stories from around the world, but this one surpassed them all, as it involved so many different aspects. August 6, 1945, changed the world in many ways. On that day, the militaristic Japanese Empire was ended and the United States was established as the world's first nuclear power. The event underscored the importance of science for military purposes, but also showed how devastating this combination can be. Furthermore, that moment changed the lives of many people affected by these bombs. Even today, Hiroshima remains synonymous with devastation and human casualties. The story of Hiroshima remains a dark reminder of the immense toll of war. The atomic bombing unleashed unimaginable suffering, highlighting the need for peace and diplomacy to prevent future conflicts. The fates of the Hibakusha will always remind us of this lesson.